Buongiorno, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for taking the time to come here and spend 1 hour to stare at the X-rays of my left knee. And given that the topic is not the lightest, and given that today we had this thing that I can't even pronounce, and I will probably digest it for the next couple of weeks, I decided to start with something light and then slowly ease into the more complicated stuff. Now, I know it doesn't show, but I work out. Yes, clearly. I have to do a better job, but I do. And a few months ago, I was doing my squats, and the knee started hurting. So I, of course, complained to my trainer, and my trainer sent me to her, not exactly a colleague, but her affiliated physical therapist. So let's put all these on screen. So here, where's me? Hurts. And here is my trainer, who of course is a girl, otherwise I would feel bad. And my physical therapist also happens to be a girl. And given that they both work to the same larger health club network, I was able to pay to both with the same card. And if this would be 2005, I'd stop here, because the anecdote is already fitting to the goals that we had in 2005, which was federation, single sign-on. You have multiple businesses, which are not the same business, they are distinct, but they are somewhat related. And so if I can federate, then I can reuse the same credentials without having to maintain a direct relationship with both. But this is 2014. Good morning. And things are different. In fact, well, how was this different? It was different when my trainer gave me a form and sent me to my physical therapist saying, please show this to your physical therapist and have her see that you sign it for me so that I can access your situation, your health situation, and design your training schedule around it, which mostly meant that I was home for about a month, but never mind. And clearly, like two ladies that speak about my body while I'm not there, fantastic, where do I sign? And I signed it right away. And here, I think that when this happened, I was really happy saying, wow, the first conference I'm going to talk about this, because it is a poster child of what companies, what businesses want today. Today is not just about signing in to the application. It is also, and largely, being able to access each other's assets programmatically using, of course, the user consent, since the businesses are just the custodians of data most of the times, and without the user being necessarily present at the time. Those are the scenarios that we really want to enable. As often is the case, the consumer area is riding the wave, is leading the way. But for businesses, we see that this is one of the most requested things. And so that's what we are going to talk about today. Oh, it was rude of me not to introduce myself. My name is Vittorio Bertocci. I am a program manager on the Azure Active Directory team, and I spend my day pretending to think about the developer experience. Oops, I saw my boss walking in. No, I actually do it. I don't pretend. I promise. And what I'm going to focus on here is on two aspects. One aspect is how you can take advantage of Azure Active Directory for the sign-in and for the API call aspect, which I described earlier. And that's one part of the equation. The other important part of the equation is provisioning. Every time you take advantage of an authority, of an identity provider, of anything from where you get authentication services, you always have to get a representation of your applications in there. And traditionally, that's always been something difficult or gated by specific technical figures, such as administrators, which have their fiefdom, and you usually have to go there and sacrifice something, or pay them at least a dinner, in order to have your application provisioned. And since we are here, and I'm talking bad about you, Can I see who are the administrators in the room? I know at least one. Okay, I wanted to see if you lied about it. Everybody else? Don't be scared. Nobody else? How many of you guys have a Visual Studio installed on your machine? That will be all. I don't need to ask for anything else. So here is how I would like to proceed. And if I keep blabbering, probably I won't make it, but I'll try. First, I'm going to talk about sign-in in general. That's going to be a look at how the world operates today and at what we support today, what you can do, and you have our blessing, it works. Then we are going to look at how Active Directory models things, how you can actually represent things in Azure Active Directory, and how these flows dovetail to that. Then we're going to talk about OpenID Connect. How many of you guys ever heard of OpenID Connect? OK, perfect. Thank you. How many of you guys ever used OpenID Connect? All right, still a sizable amount. This is California, after all. Then, after having understood how OpenID Connect works, high level, I'm not going to go in details, but at least in terms of what it can do for you, then we are going to see how we make it available for you in ASP.NET. ASP.NET is having in preview some classes that allow you to add the OpenID Connect support to your web apps very, very simply. And we are going to explore from the basic case to some slightly more advanced cases. And then we are going to touch on the SaaS part of the talk. One of the big issues with software as a service is exactly what I mentioned earlier, getting a representation of your app in the directory of your customer. Until now, it's always been a bit of a handcrafted process, and you'll see that with the release that we had this week of a feature of Azure Active Directory, this actually becomes far more streamlined. And it also gives back some of the power to the individual users, instead of having to always have everything gated to administrators. Sorry, sir, nothing personal. It's the business. All right. So, traditional sign-in. Traditional sign-in is easily explained. I open a browser and do a get of some resource. There is something which lives in front of this resource which sees that I'm not authenticated. And so it orchestrates some kind of ceremony in which I get redirected in some place where I can actually authenticate. I will get back something as a result of my successful authentication, which is typically it. Almost. You are jumping a step. A token, and perhaps also a cookie, but for the time being, a token. Then I take this token, I send it back to the resource I wanted to access, and if that resource likes it, it transforms this thing into a cookie. Finally, cookie. I know that you guys have this figure in the childhood where I just wanted a break for drinking coffee. Sorry. And once you get this cookie, the ceremony is done. And all this flow is perfectly well known. There are protocols that are very solid, very mature. And in fact, they are supported pretty much everywhere. This has been the mainstream, the golden standard for a few years. And in fact, in 2010, we started to support this in Visual Studio. It wasn't very usable, but it kept going in it, and going in it, and going in it. And now, in 2013, it's actually very, very straightforward. And in fact, before you think that I am only talking about the future, let me show you a bit of how it works in the present. Now, I'm going to open Visual Studio and show you how today, with supported technology today, you can write an application which does web sign-in with AAD. And I'm doing it only because it's very short, so it doesn't really eat much on the rest of the presentation. So let me start a brand new project and choose ASP.NET. Web Application Free is a perfectly good name. Although my ASP.NET friends beg to differ. Like every time I do that, it drives them up the wall. It's like, change the name. So why? It works. So here you might have seen that in 2013 we introduced this new feature in which directly during the creation of a project, I can come in here and choose this organizational account feature. And here I can specify my Azure Active Directory tenant. That means the instance of my directory. And this process will automatically create an entry for me in my directory representing my application, and it will configure locally my application to connect to that instance of Azure Active Directory. How many of you guys ever saw this in the past? 20%. Very good. So let me go ahead and actually do it. Developer tenant on Microsoft.com. Let's add some features here. And now what you see in here is Visual Studio asking me to provide my credentials so that it can actually reach out to the directory, hit the graph endpoint, which is our endpoint that we use for programmatic access to the directory, and it will use these credentials to obtain a token and then write the entry for my app automatically. So let's do it. Admin, developer tenant, Microsoft.com, and the password is, oh, I've been shot. And now a few moments full of tension, in which I don't know if I typed the right password or not. No, I would have not. Otherwise, it would not have closed the window. And once it's ready, I can hit OK, and then Visual Studio will actually go ahead, create this entry for me, and configure everything so that as soon as somebody tries to hit on this website, they will be automatically redirected to AD for doing the sign-in. Unfortunately, the first time you create it, it's a bit long because it downloads half of a NuGet catalog just in case. You might need jQuery, like you don't know. You wake up in the middle of the night, what is my jQuery? It's there already. But unfortunately, that means that you wait a bit. Instead, this enable organizational authentication represents the fact that I'm now doing the call to the directory, and I'm done. Perfect. And so this thing, if I want to be like blissfully ignorant of what happens, is just hit F5, and slowly, but surely, I get IIS Express up. And as soon as I try to hit this thing, I will get redirected to authenticate to Azure AD, all in due time. Luckily, I have my wired connection. Also, during the editing of a video, probably they'll speed up this part. So I should speak slowly. Come on, IIS Express. Come on. Perfect. Great. So here, let me enter as Mario, who's one user in my directory. And of course, if the application has been recently registered, please wait for some time for the configuration to take effect. OK, so it was probably waiting for a good reason, because there must be some other thing going on, and I must have been queued. Let me hit F5 again, cross every limb I can cross. Let's see if I manage to stand while I do so. I can. And if it won't work, I will just ask you to imagine that it worked, which I know sucks, but hey. If life gives you lemon, let me try to sign in again. Maybe it's Mario, that for some reason he's been discriminated. Happens often to Italians, or maybe to people with long hair, I don't know. I have a survivorship bias. And slowly, but steadily, there must be some deployment going on. Ta-da! Fantastic. Thank you, demo gods. As you can see here, I signed in. Normally, this is a 3-minute demo. It took a bit longer just to test my patience. Well played. But anyway, this is how things work today. Perfect. Now, let's just take a quick peek at what it took to get to this place. The technology that we are using here is Windows Identity Foundation. How many of you guys ever used Windows Identity Foundation? Look at that. I would say a good 45%. That's great. Now, Windows Identity Foundation has been the base technology for all the adoption of claims-based identity in the last 5 years in the Microsoft platform, and it worked pretty well. However, it has, let's just say that if you don't know what you are doing, like if you are not a protocol expert, and if you needed to do something slightly different from what the default does, then you might find yourself in an interesting position. I have a very good book I can suggest. But it's that's not how it should work. And just to give you a feeling, in order to have Windows Identity Foundation do its magic in front of your app, you have to put some content in the web config. In the web config, you have various settings, like the one that I'm showing here, in which you represent some of the coordinates of the identity provider that you want to talk with, and you have the explicit adding of these modules in your pipeline. And then you have lots of other little details, like, for example, here we have something which swaps the default way in which you protect cookies with something which works with Windows Azure, so in a low-level detail. Or then we have the same information repeated in a number of different places. So this is not the most usable of the bunch. And now, please keep this thought on hold, and I will get back to it later in the presentation. Now, let's go back to, instead, our stack. And let's see the next step, which is how all these happened. How we actually made all this happen. Let's take a look at what it took to configure this thing in Azure AD. And then we'll take advantage of this knowledge for doing things ourselves. Now, Azure Active Directory, how many of you guys went to Stuart's session earlier? Good amount. So you guys already know. For everybody else, Azure Active Directory is a multi-tenant system. So you, as the customer of AD, get to have a tenant. This tenant is your directory, the instance of your directory in the cloud. If you have your on-prem directory, this on-cloud directory will be a projection of your on-prem, and there will be a service which keeps the two in sync in one direction. Or you can potentially choose to have everything in the cloud. I'm not going to go into any of these details. I'm just saying these because once we'll start talking about a multi-tenant, you'll need to have a firm grasp of this. So say that, for example, here there is the Contoso directory. But let's say that instead of being Contoso, we are Fabricam. So here there is just another of those instances. And this instance is the resource that we are going to work with. So once I launched Visual Studio, what happened? I programmatically added one entry which describes my app in the portal. I got in here, and I created this entry. And all these took place automatically. And I did that thanks to the fact that I got this token, which is used for writing to the Graph API, and also I asked for the address of my tenant so that I could know which endpoints I'd have to work with. And one of the endpoints, which is very important in here, is the endpoint which gives the metadata of the directory. The metadata is a set of descriptions of the directory in itself, which allow a generic client to interact with the directory using a specific set of protocols. And these data are something that go from the identifier that you can expect when you get a token from this directory to the key that is used for signing the tokens that you receive. And so those are all information you need for configuring things on your app. And in fact, another thing that the tool did was to configure Windows Identity Foundation, which sits in front of the app, and all the things that you saw on the web config were basically coordinates which were doing that. And now the flow is pretty straightforward. Azure Active Directory have a set of endpoints which represent mostly, not only, but mostly represent the protocols that are supported. And then the flow is pretty normal. You have your user. User navigates to the app. which is in here, get intercepted by Windows Identity Foundation. Windows Identity Foundation look up the configuration and knows that it has to redirect to, oops, sorry. It has to redirect to, in this specific case, WS Federation. And then, if everything goes well, it gets back a token. This token gets put in here. And now Windows Identity Foundation is configured to use this key to verify the signature, verify the identity of the issuer, and similar. And if it's satisfied here, sends back a cookie. Voila. This was supposed to be like a pretzel. Oops. That was my best effort at clip art. It's also why it doesn't show that I work out. OK, so this is the protocol. Now, let's separate the issue of how we implemented the protocol with Windows Identity Foundation, so with all these config elements, which you must rely on a tool for generating. You can write that stuff by hand, with the potential shortcomings of the protocol in itself. As you can see here, I satisfied the first part of my scenario, in which I signed in. Fantastic. But what if now I want to get my application and access a resource programmatically from the server side? There is nothing in WS Federation which helps me to do that. Now, I'm not blocked. I can use another protocol. I can compose protocols. And that's typically what is done today. And it's possible, but it has, let's say, some awkward aspects, such as, for example, now I have to take this up, and I have to describe it in different terms. Like, this app is projected on the wire in a way for WS Federation. If I use another protocol, such as OAuth, for instead requesting the token, then it will be projected in a different way, which, of course, is less than optimal. So let's take a super quick look at how OAuth works. How many of you guys ever used OAuth? Oh, OK. How many of you guys like it? Come on. It's not bad. It's not bad at all. Nobody likes it? Wow. Luckily, we have libraries so that you can use those libraries and forget that you are using OAuth. But it's useful at least once in your lifetime to see in a bit details of how this works. Now, let's just make a super quick case for it. Say that you have your user again, which is accessing one application. And he might be signed in with his application using whatever protocol it wants. Membership provider, ADFS, anything you want. And let's say that this app now wants to access this resource on behalf of a user. Now, the flow is as follows. The application crafts a specific request. It's a URL, which contains some parameters, and that are typically, this is the identifier of my app. It's the client. This is the identifier of a resource that I want. And then redirects the user toward one specific endpoint, which is called the authorization endpoint, of one specific entity, which is called the authorization server. And that is the entity that is used for regulating access to resources. And Azure Active Directory is an authorization server. So it features those endpoints that are specific to your tenant. So there is an address which deals with that. And now, the user will be presented with some kind of UI for authenticating, if it's not authenticated. And after that, they'll be typically presented with some kind of consent prompt in which they are asked, are you OK with web app 1 to access resource 1? And if they say that they are OK, then they get back a code, which is an opaque string, which is somehow a reminder for the authorization server that, yep, authorization took place. This code is forwarded to the web app. And from now on, the web app does everything on the server side and hits another endpoint, which is called the token endpoint. And here it presents the code. It presents some secret that was agreed upon in the past between the two. And if everything goes well, the application gets back a token. A token which, in this case, we call the access token, is a token designed for getting access to this resource. And then at this point, you can send this token to the resource, and gain access. How many of you guys already knew about this? No, still less than 50%, so I don't feel guilty that I've shown it, just so we are clear. OK, so this one is the intended usage of a protocol. However, very often on the web, you will observe that people really do a bit of an invalid cast. Like, let's say that you are resource one, and you are a website. And let's say that you don't want to get into the business of managing users yourself. And you'd very much like to, for example, take advantage that everybody has a Facebook account. How many of you guys have a Facebook account? How many of you guys work for Facebook? Come on, this is San Francisco. Nobody? I'm offended. OK. I know you're here. You're just not showing up. But the idea is that this resource would like to sign in their own users rather than granting delegated access to others using Facebook. So what do? They kind of piggyback on this, and they do something similar. So imagine that this first leg that we did, the user wasn't really authenticated. And you just send this user on this flow without having a previous session. And say that once you obtain the access token and you try to use it and you were successful, then you draw the conclusion, OK, this guy, I sent this guy to Facebook. He came back. He gave me a token. I can't look inside this token because that's not for me. That's for Facebook. But I can use it. And if it works, then I'll just be happy, and I'll decide that the user is authenticated. And so I'll just drop my own cookie, and that's it. And so people reinvented sign-in using OAuth. And this works. It might not be fantastic, but it does work, and it leverages existing infrastructure. So what is the problem? The problem is when you try to standardize this approach. Because if you want somebody, like we are a platform provider, so I get people all the time that come to me and say, why didn't you provide me with something that I can use with every provider? Put it in front of my website and just do sign-in for everybody. Well, writing a generic provider is impossible. Like you can do by enumeration. You can have like subclasses that do this for Facebook, this for Twitter, this for LinkedIn. It's impossible because using this trick, this leg is intrinsically proprietary. When you try to use the token, you are using it against the resource of that of the provider you are working with. So with Facebook, you are accessing the graph. With Twitter, you are accessing the Twitter APIs. They are different. So how can we standardize on these? We can't. But given that this was a very, large problem, then the industry stepped in and said, you know what? We are going to formalize this approach. We are going to create a standard which does exactly this, but we fill the blanks. So we'll define exactly what that leg means. We'll define exactly the format of a token that we are sending. We will add extra parameters for orchestrating this flow so that it's clear that this is happening and it's not a side effect. And so X protocol was born. What is X? Operator Connect, exactly. Normally, I would say, I don't have any swag, and so sorry, because I don't have budget. But the former speaker forgot his speakers, was our speakers. So you heard one. You're very welcome. All right. I even got my bit of exercise. Open Connect, correct. So just again, to take a very quick look, this is how it works. Say that now I actually have a module that lives in front of my app and can implement this because this is a protocol. I have my user hitting this part, and the middleware, this module, finds out that the user is not authenticated. And so it redirects the user to this endpoint, and this time it specifies I want to sign in the user, and I want to have access to that resource, all in the same movement. And then, if everything goes well, you get back two things. You get back an ID token, which is a token that actually represents the user, and it is intended for the app. It's not intended for the resource. So the app can read it. It cannot be opaque to it. and then the code, which is the same code as before. So this thing comes over here. Maybe if I use the mouse, the keyboard will stay where it belongs. And then this thing gets all sent to the service. And now the middleware can finally directly validate this token. It can look at this token. It can use the information that found in the metadata, like this is the issuer. Those are the keys that are used for signing in. So it can actually tell directly if the token is good. It doesn't have to try to use it. And then it also obtained the code. So now it can, if it wants to connect to the API, and we established that, yes, it's very interesting, now it can grab this code, do the same flow that we said earlier, like send it to the token endpoint. Yep, almost. Come on, PowerPoint, collaborate. And get back my fantastic access token, and then just make my call. So finally, I have obtained what I wanted. I can sign in. I can, in the same movement, obtain access to APIs. And I can do this in standardized fashion. So I can give a library, and you can use that library everywhere. There is somebody that supports Operator Connect. So that's pretty cool. Now, clearly, we wanted to use Operator Connect. And we did not support it before in our programming model. So what happened is that we took the opportunity to take our programming model, which has all that stuff in the web config, which you need to rely on a tool for generating, and do a bit of simplification. Now, the image that you have in there is something that I stumbled upon, let's say, a couple of months ago on Reddit. And I knew it was going to be useful for this, because this represents exactly how we were thinking for simplifying the programming model. If you go on the web config, and you are far in the autistic spectrum like I am, I've been spending a lot of time in this space. So when I look at that web config, I don't see the web config. I see the right pieces. Like I know that the important things are the issuer and the realm, and I ignore everything else because I'm just trained to it. But for a person with a normal social life, you look at the web config and you see a lot of noise, and it's hard for you to parse. So what we did was exactly that. Like we took all the config settings that are boilerplate, that you don't need to affect for the normal case, and we just put them out of the way, so that you can now take exactly the same settings that you were adding in the tool, and then the tool was generating everything. Now you take the same settings and you put them directly in the code. And then it's the code that does the job of the tool. So if now, eventually we'll still support these through tooling, because easy does not mean fun. Like after the 100th web application in which you go and you type this thing, it kind of gets old. Like at first I was all happy, look at how easy it is. And then today we released the tools, and I've been doing like 100 of those. And I would have very much liked to have a tool to just generate it. But the point is, I no longer require it. Now, if I want, I can do it by hand. Allow me to demonstrate. How many of you guys already know what OWIN stands for? 12, perhaps. OK. For everybody else, OWIN stands for Open Web Interface for .NET. It is an open standard which describes how you can write an HTTP-based application without having any knowledge of the actual platform where this thing is going to run. And as the name implies, this is all designed to be on .NET. The reason for this is that as we move forward, there are more and more scenarios where people would really, really like to be able to rehost their application in high-density servers where there is no IIS. Or in general, have like parallel pipelines in which the same application plays multiple roles. And the old HTTP modules were ill-fitted for those purposes. And so ASP.NET moved wholesale toward this new model. And so in, of course, BitLocker, yeah, let's do it now. Why not? Sorry. Of course, this model was already, they are using it for everything, so for us it was very natural to latch to it and do all of our new protocol support based on that. And the good news is that the syntax for using Owen is already like very, very clean. And what you can see in here is a good example of what it takes to take one existing app and make it OpenID Connect aware. The first two lines are just a boilerplate. Like they are the same every time, unless you want to do something different from the standard, which is they just translate it into I want to maintain a session, and I will use cookies for maintaining this session. That's all they are saying. So very straightforward. We could have hidden that as well. Here, we could have hidden. I don't know. I slept too little for managing the consecutive temporum in English. So we could have made something for making those things invisible, but we didn't because today using cookies for session is the standard. But tomorrow, you might decide to use something else. And so for that reason, we decided to maintain them explicitly. And you'll see that this is a pattern that is pretty common in the Owen pipeline. The thing that is really interesting for us is the third line, this OpenID Connect authentication. This third line is an extension method which works on this application object, which is the main primitive in Owen, and it just says, in the pipeline of all the middleware that you execute every time you receive a request, please add the OpenID Connect module. And the things that we are passing there are the equivalent of the things that we would normally get from a tooling. So the client ID is the identifier of your application. Now, I know that this might be confusing, and I was somewhat confused at first as well, so let me clarify. Remember that in this case, we are piggybacking on top of OAuth. And from the OAuth point of view, this application is the client. This is the application which is asking for a token for accessing a resource, because that was the origin of all this flow. So when we say client ID, and we are in this scenario, the client ID is actually the ID of your service. Yes, I don't see anybody being very surprised, so that's good. And then the authority instead is a construct which we have fairly specific for AAD. The authority is mostly the identifier, like the URL for your tenant. And we can specify that because on the base of that, the code can derive the address of a metadata document. The metadata document contains all the coordinates for understanding tokens from that specific tenant. So again, the signing key, the identifier of that issuer, and so on and so forth. So once you provide all these, this thing will take care of downloading all the important information and keep them fresh. So that if, for example, for some reason, the key changes, because for security reason, the key will change pretty often, then every time you execute this initialization code, you will get a fresh key, which is great because business continuity is not necessarily guaranteed, but promoted. And all this nicely connects with the authorize attribute. So if you are already using the authorize attribute for protecting your controllers and similar, you keep doing that, and the Owen pipeline will simply understand that when you use that thing, it needs to pick up the OpenID Connect and use it. So very, very straightforward. And just to give you a feeling of that, let me pick one. I was toying with the idea of doing this directly on stage. I've done that in the past. But in the last 2 days, the NuGet feed has been a bit shaky. So I didn't want to push my luck. So here I'm using a pre-configured one. But it shouldn't make much of a difference. And here there is the relevant code. Let me make it a bit bigger so that you can see it. I said a bit bigger, and voila. So here it's pretty much the same code that I was showing earlier. The only difference is that I'm also specifying the URL that I want this to come back to if I sign out. which by default we don't pick up automatically. So that's all the code that is required. Then there is other code, which is like initializing the OWIN pipeline. But as soon as ASP.NET will standardize on this, you'll get that as boilerplate in the same way in which you get jQuery and all the other stuff that ASP.NET gets. And just to see that it works, I'll hit F5 and hope for the best. Of course, big conferences are always trying times for these things because like we turn on preview features, we have many people hitting on it, so hiccups are to be expected. So here I have my app. I can hit the sign in button. And I will spare you the various back and forth with Fiddler. I also considered capturing the network traffic and showing you how it maps to what I was describing earlier. But then I decided that after lunch, that would have been too much. Et voila. As you can see in here, I signed in, and it was just a few lines of code. I didn't really have to have all that stuff laid out. Now, that's the default. Now, let's say that we want to understand a bit more how this works. Oops. If I want to do operations like sign in and sign out and similar, I can actually do it, again, using the OWIN convention. There is always this idea of OWIN context, which is a way for you to grab a hold of the OWIN pipeline, which lives in front of your app. And then sign in OWIN terms is called a challenge, as in I was trying to get to an app, to a resource. I was not authorized, and so I was challenged. It's like perfectly equivalent to saying sign in is just how to say the twist that you might expect from an app-based stack like ASP.NET. And then the sign out is pretty much the same. Now, the interesting thing about sign out is that your session is represented in multiple ways, and it lives in different places. So the cookie is clearly something which keeps track of your session. And the cookie is something that is used also by other stacks. Like if you do membership provider, the cookie middleware is what is used there as well. So it has to be addressed on its own because it's independent from OpenID Connect. And OpenID Connect has its own protocol characteristics when you are signing out. And once you are in this logic, you don't necessarily know what was added in the pipeline. And so as of today, when you want to sign out, you have to say explicitly, sign out from the cookies, sign out from OpenID Connect. And if you stack other stuff, you'd have to specify that as well. Now, this is still in preview, so it's very fluid. So if you guys have feedback, by all means, send it over. And the other things that are important in here are the options that I pass to my extension method. Those options contain all the coordinates that define an OpenID Connect relationship between an application and a provider and the resource that it wants to call. There you have seen the bare minimum, and you have seen the flow which is driven by metadata. But if you want to build everything from scratch, you can. You have all sorts of settings. In fact, here, if you peel the tape from the remote, that's what you get. Those are all things that you can set explicitly. So for example, say that you don't have metadata, you can specify exactly where is your authorization endpoint. You can change your redirect URI on the fly. Say that you are in multi-tenant application, and say that your tenancy model has the name of a tenant in the middle. Now you can change this thing dynamically and inject it. But the good point here is that if you want the default, you don't need to be exposed to any of that. It's all on demand. You just go in there and you hit the tab. Now, one thing that is of particular interest, at least in my opinion, is this set of what we call notifications. Now, if you worked with Windows Identity Foundation, you know that we had a set of events that you could manage, which gave you the possibility of injecting your own logic as a part of a validation pipeline or as part of a protocol pipeline. And this was a very, very successful model. Like, people really liked it, and that's one of the things that I've seen used the most. So we clearly did not want to lose it. And in the Owin model, this is done all with delegates. We define a set of notifications, which is associated to the options, and you can very easily inline your logic, so that if you want to do something, you just go in your startup and just add the logic that you want to perform, or you can declare those as a separate tasks, and then you can assign them on the fly, so that if you have your own DLL with all these notifications, and you just want to reuse it across the board, you can do that as well. And we've been working with some internal partners that were very, very eager to use OpenID Connect, and just like every internal partners, they were very special snowflake, and they needed their own features. And so we had to, really work for making sure that they could do what they wanted. And I'm happy to report that all of those extensibility points were up to the job. Like, everything that they threw at us, we managed to actually handle it. So I'm looking forward to see what you guys will do with it, but I am optimistic that most of the cases, it will have enough expressive power. And let's see what else we have. OK. And actually, to just give you an example, I have some commented code here in which, if you wanted to modify this logic, you can simply declare inline the things that you want to do, and then you just add your logic right away in there. So it's very straightforward. And in fact, this is one of the ways in which we do the other leg of the flow, which is to obtain a code. In order to obtain a code, we just have a notification of this access code received. And here, instead of giving a simplified version, I added everything, just in case. And the idea is that here we are using ADAL.NET. How many of you guys ever used ADAL? Few. For everybody else, ADAL stands for Active Directory Authentication Library. It's a library available in multiple platforms, which helps you to be a client of Azure Active Directory and resources. It helps you to obtain tokens. And what I'm using here, in fact, is pretty much doing that. Let me select the relevant code. Without going into the details, because unfortunately we don't have much time, but in this call, as you can see, I am connecting to one authority, which is the authority of the current caller. Like, within this notification, I have information about the current user because it was already authenticated. I am late in the pipeline. And I can construct a request for the resource that I want. In this case, I want to call the Graph API. And I can pass the code, and I will just get back this token. So this is how you implement the flow that I described earlier. Now, let's spend some time talking about multi-tenancy. And rather than show you that, I will show you in a visual format. OK. So let's say that you created this application. What we have seen earlier was for your own employees. Like, if you create an app and you want it to be a line of business app, the flow that I described is exactly what you want. But now, say that you have a fantastic idea for a SaaS application. It's going to be the next Office 365. And it's going to have millions of customers. So how can you deal with the fact that all those customers will have their own directory? As you have seen so far, every time I created that object, I always initialized it with my own directory, Contoso, Microsoft.com, and similar. And instead here, you'd want this app to accept tokens from all of your customers. So how do you do that? Well, the good news is that Windows Azure AD has a specific mechanism for doing it. When you create an application, you can then later go to the portal, and provided that you follow certain hygiene rules, like the identifier of your app has to be a domain that you own and things like that, but it's very easy stuff. There is a switch that you can throw, and you can click on this switch and just say, I want to have my application multi-tenant, which means that when somebody that comes from a different directory than yours tries to access your resource, this somebody will be prompted, saying, you're trying to access this resource. Like this app is trying to access this resource, trying to do this list of permissions. Are you OK with that? And if the user says OK, then your application will be automatically provisioned in the target directory, and you will have, to say, acquired a new customer. This is a bit abstract, so let me just show you the experience of how this actually works. But let's, by all means, let me close all the other ones so that we free precious memory. And we want no, we want this one. This is an app that I already prepared with all the various settings for doing multi-tenancy. And let me just start it. You'll see that this app has a, attached to process. This was new. Let's wait for a second before things go out of hand. You'll see that the aspect of this application has been modified a bit to fit the scenario, and I'll describe in a moment what that means. Say that I have my application, and that I want to acquire users. Before, when I hit sign in, it was like automatic. I knew already from which directory I wanted users. But instead here, I have this multi-tenant system. So let's say that I have an onboarding mechanism in which people can land on my application without any authentication yet, go through some kind of process, I don't know, perhaps go on PayPal and pay for my app, and then come back with a receipt or stuff like that. And let's say that at the end of it, once I'm satisfied, I can actually trigger this flow so that they can go to their directory, provision the app, and start using it. So let's just make an example here. Here, I just have a sign-up experience. If I hit sign up, I will see the redirect that I described earlier. My application will attempt to obtain a token. And if I sign in as a user from a different directory, which I will do promptly, something interesting will happen. Now I am from customer tenant, not developer tenant. Yeah, sure, why not updating Office? You don't mind, right? Can I update Office? OK, what you see here is the fact that I signed in as a user of customer tenant, but my application was created in developer tenant. So my application entry does not exist in the target tenant yet. And so I am asked, as a user, if I am OK with this app to access my directory. And here it tells me what are the things that it wants to do with my directory. And if I want to know a bit more, I have this show more, in which it tells me everything. It tells me all my contacts and similar, which is great, especially when you have multiple users in multiple places, so that you can always distinguish. So once I hit OK, the system will provision the application in the new directory, mark it as in this user, of course. You know what happened here is that I spoke too long. So when you speak for a long time, IIS Express gets bored. I guess that you can relate. And it decides, you know what, and it just closes. But luckily, I have all my state on a database, so I can happily restart it, paste the URL, and voila, nothing happened. We are back on the saddle. So what happens is that here I'm getting my response from a service which actually contains the code for going and obtaining the token. And at this point, my application has been provisioned, signed up. And in fact, if I come here and I hit on the sign in button, then since I already signed in, for some reason it wants me to sign in again. And voila, the system just acquired another customer. And now, if just for kicks, in this specific application, which, by the way, is available in full source on GitHub, so if you want to see exactly how it works, you can go there and see it. It's actually wired up to call the Graph API so that you can actually see how the redemption of that code works. In fact, in here, I got far more information than I could in my sign-in token about the current user. And now, just to show you a quick representation of what happened here, let's see. Here we had our Luigi, so hat. And Luigi tried to get to the application. The application started the consent flow and basically redirected to Contoso. Contoso popped out this consent page, which I might have somewhere. And here it is. And once Luigi said, OK, then what happened is that this app got provisioned here. And it was provisioned with, oops, not yet, with specifically with this permission. Now, we were able to do that with just a common user as opposed to an administrator because the permissions that the application that we developed were what we call a user consent level. Let's say that users can actually be the one saying, yes, I'm OK with this resource being accessed. However, if we would have had a bit of like more serious capabilities, such as, for example, a directory write, something that actually requires to put things in the directory, then this flow would have failed. Luigi would have tried to get into the application, and the system would have just said, I'm sorry, but I need an administrator. And another difference that you can use is that the flow that I've shown today is for users, and even if you sign in as an administrator, you'll still be provisioning this app just for the administrator as a user. However, there is a more traditional flow, which we call the admin consent flow, in which you can add an extra parameter when you are asking for a token. And this extra parameter will tell to the directory that you want to ask permission for the entire organization, so that the administrator can say, yes, I want to use this app. And as soon as the administrator does that, it gives permission to all the users in the organization, so that you don't have to provision them one by one, which is a great value. And I had some more detailed things, but unfortunately, I ran out of time. So I wanted to mention that all the libraries that we described are about authentication, but we do have also a new library, the Graph API library, which is designed to make it easy for you to access the resources in the directory. Like normally, you can happily use a pure REST approach, pure OData, and just hit the graph endpoints and add, do crude operations with the graph entities. But we got strong feedback that people like IntelliSense and all these interesting ease of modern life. And so the Graph API team created this library, which is currently in preview. Please download it, take a look at it. All of our sample use them, so that you'll get a feeling of how is the object model. And what there is more to say? Unfortunately, the topic is enormous, so there's so much stuff that I would have liked to dig into, but the good news is all the things that we have seen and more are in our samples, which you can find on GitHub on Azure AD samples. We'll keep refining them. Every time that we add features to the product, we'll reflect that in the samples. And the OWIN components, if you are interested in the source, can be found under the Katana project on Codeplex. That's the same project where you find the entire ASP.NET. So it will be there right at home. In my experience, people are less interested in that. They just like to use it. And it's already in NuGet. You can just go in NuGet, put the pre-release flag and say OpenID Connect, and you'll get it down. Don't try it today because it doesn't work, but tomorrow. And Of course, if you are interested in ADIL, it's also in there. And if you are working on other platforms, you'll find the code for iOS, for Android, for all these guys. So we are exactly on 3:30. So I'll let you go. I will stay here if you want to ask me questions. Thank you for your patience.